Hey, this is Ricky Gantz of G220 Ministries, and this here is going to be a review of Apologetics Live. Let's get into it.
Hey, wait, before we get to Biden and Trump, let's start with something that Justin said, because we have to recognize this first. Pastor Justin said that God is the God of politics. Politics is within not a secular realm. It's all within God's realm.
Exactly.
This is who put Nebuchadnezzar in place as king?
That's right.
God did. God not only put him in place, but God said that he would use Nebuchadnezzar to teach the nation of Israel a lesson, because they were under God's judgment for their disobedience. And this is a foreign concept, I think, for many Christians in America, to think that somehow God would allow judgment to come on his people, and that he would use this wicked foreign pagan king to do so. Well, yes, exactly. God raised him up specifically for that purpose and allowed him to do that. God is the one who put Barack Obama in office. God is the one that put Donald Trump in office.
And what Andrew is doing here is he's beginning to lay down this foundation before they get into this conversation that they're planning on having on their show that they did on Thursday night, Apologetics Live. And this isn't even something that I'm really disagreeing with, so much as it began to, as I was listening to this, lay down a foundation, which is what he's trying to do. But it began to get the wheels kind of turning in my head, where I'm like, as it continues to go, this is refuting their whole argument, which is why I laid the comment there that the show's over. Basically, you're refuting yourselves here by the argument that you're trying to establish as your groundwork. And so we'll get to that here. But just so that people are aware, of course, God is placing into power these rulers. Romans 13 tells us that every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And these are established by God. In Daniel, as Nebuchadnezzar is mentioned, Daniel is speaking to Nebuchadnezzar, and God is speaking here through Daniel. It is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. We also see in chapter 2 of Daniel as well, where he basically tells them that he is giving into the hands all these things to Nebuchadnezzar because he is the head of gold. And so all these things have been given to him by God. And so these aren't anything new, nothing we would disagree with. Even in the Gospel of John, in the New Testament, we see this, as I already mentioned, Romans 13. But even in the Gospels, John tells us that Jesus answered, and he said, he's speaking to Pilate, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given you from above." So Pilate didn't have any power over Christ in his position unless God had established him to that position and put him forth in that position. So nothing really to disagree with there, but I did want to include that because I didn't want to kind of clip it right where he's kind of laying his foundation. But I this is, again, where it began to kind of start to sync together with me as I'm listening to this and thinking that you're refuting your own argument here as to what you're trying to accomplish, I believe. And they can disagree with me, and you can disagree with me if you like. But as we begin to look at this, I think hopefully it will become more clear.
The question that ends up getting into place here is, it's not a question of, well, that's in a secular realm, I don't do that, because there are people out there who are trying to say that as Christians we shouldn't be voting because that's not our realm. We only work in the church. The reality is there is no secular versus sacred distinction in the scriptures. everything is sacred. And the voting, the fact that we have that right is something that is it's in the sacred category.
We absolutely have the right to vote. It is a blessing that in this nation, God has given us the ability to choose our political leaders. In this case, we're talking about the presidency, which is coming quickly. And we have that right. But just because we have a right doesn't mean it's always right to do so. If a Christian has the convictions that they cannot go against their conscience in voting for the Republican candidate, then a Christian has that right. And when people say that if you don't vote for Trump, then you're complicit in Biden getting elected. To me, that sounds very similar, if we apply that logic, to the social justice warrior crowd, to those in Christianity that are in the woke movement that will say silence is violence. Silence is violence. If you do not speak out against these things, if you do not stand with Black Lives Matter, which is an anti-Christ organization, if you do not stand with Antifa and these people that are standing up and fighting for quote unquote justice, if you don't do these things, your silence is showing that you are complicit in racism. Well, that's a ridiculous argument. That's a foolish argument. For a Christian, we can look and say, the reason I don't stand with the Black Lives Matter organization or with these things that are going on is because I have a biblical foundation that I am applying those biblical principles to make those decisions. So the same thing. You can't accuse a Christian of being complicit in Biden becoming president of the United States. As we've already established, God is the one who sets these rulers up into power. You can't say a Christian is complicit in that if they choose and say, I'm not voting for Biden, or I'm not voting for Trump. You can't hold them responsible for the other getting into office because they chose to use their voice to say no more. I'm not doing it. I'm not going to be one of these two-party puppets. I'm going to vote based upon my convictions. My conscience won't allow me to do so, so I won't do it. Now, if your conscience allows you to vote for Trump, okay. Again, I wouldn't even have gotten into this conversation if that was not the charge that I continuously hear from people, because I choose to not vote for Biden and I choose to not vote for Trump. Now, if I choose to vote for a third-party candidate because my conscience will allow me to do that, that would be my right as a Christian, as a individual in the United States of America, to have that right to do that. And like I said, that right in doing so can be viewed as, and in my case, I know because I know my own motives and intentions, it's my voice speaking up and saying, I'm not going to be a part of this two-party candidacy. I'm not going to be a part of these individuals that I believe go against or hold to things that go against my convictions and my beliefs as a Christian. So you have a right to do it, but just because you have a right doesn't mean it's always right.
So what we have to recognize is when we look at government, it is God who establishes these people to be in place. If God is going to give us a candidate who is wicked and evil, that is God's purpose. And so for people who are like, well, I can't vote for a guy because he's not the best Christian candidate. And yeah. Ethan said it earlier. He put a post up. I don't know if we could find it, but he said, son, I've said for years is we're voting for president, not pastor. Yeah. And the qualifications are different. We're not going to look for the qualifications of a pastor to argue that the person must be saved if he's going to be president. You know, there's plenty of Christians who would make a horrible president just because the person's a Christian and has rock solid theology doesn't make him a good world leader. There's Ethan's comment. Thank you. Okay. And so this is a thing we have to recognize before we get into discussing the possible candidates is the question is who would make the best president? And right now in our day, this actually is not about the candidates. Okay. And I'll see what you guys think about this, but I am not going to go to the voting booth and vote for Trump or Biden or even Tom. How do I pronounce his last name? I forget now.
Hopefully.
Hofling. Sorry. Thank you. So we're not, I'm not going to vote for Hofling or Trump or Biden based on them as an individual. Because the reality, this is one of those elections that's much more than just a person.
See, as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking to myself, like, does anybody else seeing this? Is anybody recognizing what's going on here? Because they're refuting themselves. There's really no need to have a show. It's not about the candidates. So what are we doing talking about Tom Hoffling? Why do we need to know all these questions about his faith? Why do we need to know about his wife being a Mormon or not a Mormon? Why do we need to know these things? It's not about the candidates. It's not about what they believe. As Andrew just said, it's not that the person must be saved to be president. So what is the point? What is the point in asking Tom Hoffling to come on and answer these questions about his Mormon background or his wife's Mormon background or his not having a testimony online? This is what I don't believe they see, and I believe that is continuously ignored by these men and others that hold to the same position and want to argue these points against Tom Hoffling. And again, this is not me defending Tom Hoffling. He's a grown man. Like I said, he can defend himself. I'm not here to defend him. But these same types of things that you're seeking to ask Tom Hoffling, your own candidate wouldn't pass these things. So I don't understand how or why the need to continue to press that. Because again, I feel like you're logically, losing your own argument, because you said, it's not about the candidates and it's not that they have to be saved to be president. So it's kind of moot. It's kind of irrelevant. Then, you're voting for somebody based upon the positions that they take, what they're laying forward as to what they would do in the office of president of the United States of America. It baffles my mind, like how that just continues to be ignored. And the phrase comes up over and over. I've been accused of it, that we're not voting for a pastor, we're voting for president. Whoever said that I'm trying to, when I'm doing this, looking at who I'm going to vote for, I'm looking for a pastor. You go to church and sit under a pastor. I'm not looking for a pastor to be the president of the United States of America. I don't vote for people based upon whether or not they're a Christian. Again, I'm voting based upon my convictions and my conscience of what which informs me as to what I will stand for and what I won't stand for. So it just seems like it's kind of thrown out the window for their own candidate, but then it's not about the candidates. It's not about them being saved to be president. You're not voting for a president or a pastor. You're voting for a president. But then let me ask all these questions about this candidate. But then when the questions are asked about your own personal candidate, well, it's not about that. We're voting for a president, not a pastor. So I just find it to be inconsistent.
This is really what's at stake now, is the American way of life and Christianity being legal. Because I believe if the Marxists take over, Christianity's done. I mean, if you look, that Black Lives Matter protester who was having lunch with her friend when all the protesters came by and wanted them to stick their hand up, maybe everyone doesn't realize that she was actually the one that wouldn't raise her hand and was being abused at the restaurant, was actually a Black Lives Matter protester that refused because everyone was telling her she had to do it. And she felt like, I'm not going to give in to what people forced me to do. But the irony is what were they all doing? They asked her one question: are you a Christian? Because that's the one thing the Marxists can't handle.
Exactly.
This is what's at stake this election. It's not about right now Trump versus Biden versus anybody else. It's really about the American way of life and democracy and capitalism versus socialism and Marxism, and an ending of America and an ending of the Christian witness. And that is what's at stake. One of the things if we want, Ricky Gantz saying you are actually refuting yourselves. Show over. Well, I'd love for Ricky to come on in and show us how we are.
I think what I'm hearing here from Andrew Rappaport is the most concerning. Because there's things that he's saying here that are just not biblically true. They're just not what you would think a Christian standing upon a firm foundation would say. A Christian who says that they are not afraid of whatever may come. When persecution comes, will continue to stand and fight. We'll continue to proclaim Christ, preach Christ, crucified, risen, and coming again, even in the face of persecution. But what he said, if Marxists take over, Christianity is done. It's done. It's the ending of the Christian witness. Those are quotes from what he said. You can go back and listen to that portion of the video there. Ending of a Christian witness. Marxists take over, Christianity is done. This is why I said these men are refuting their own argument, or Andrew's refuting whatever they're about to get into, because this is the same man who started this off by saying how God is sovereign over human authority because they are instituted by God. He's the one that put Obama in power. He's the one that put Trump in power. And should Biden get elected, he's the one that puts Biden in power. And he's going through and using Nebuchadnezzar as an example. But the Babylonians took over Egypt, or not Egypt, excuse me. When the Babylonians took over Israel, when they captured Israel, Israel wasn't done. God still had a purpose and a plan to bring forth his people to ultimately bring about the Messiah. And if Marxists take over this country, Christianity's not done. God's still going to build his church. We don't live in fear of what may possibly happen or what the Lord may bring about in this country moving forward. It's not the end of the Christian witness. Christians will continue to proclaim Christ, even if it costs them their life. Not that we're out here trying to be the next martyr, but that's just the reality for those that are in Christ. They're going to continue to preach Christ, regardless of the persecution that may come upon them for doing so. I find that concerning. Your argument is that you're not voting for pastor. It's not about the candidates. They don't have to be saved to be president. It's really about Marxism taking over. And we don't fear that. But if that happens, Christianity's done. That speaks for itself. Let's just move on.
He refuted himself in that Facebook posts when he admitted that he was voting for Tom based on the fact that he was Christian, and then later said it doesn't matter that he's Christian. So that's the refutation for him.
All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to address what Andrew Rappaport just said, in a separate video, because I do believe that he needs to repent for what he said. I believe that he is wrong for what he said. And if he publicly does that and comes forth and repents it, then I will pull that other video with my response to it down. But I'm going to respond to that in another video.